The snow fell heavily, blanketing the world in a silent, icy embrace. The wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie symphony that only the forest could understand. Mr. Thompson, the old guard, pulled his coat tighter around his frail body as he trudged through the snow-covered grounds of the orphanage. His lantern flickered in the cold, casting long, dancing shadows. As he made his way along the edge of the forest, something caught his eye, a small dark shape lying motionless in the snow. His heart raced as he approached, fearing the worst. He knelt down and brushed away the snow, revealing a tiny, fragile girl, her face pale and dotted with bruises. She was shivering uncontrollably, her breath barely visible in the frigid air. "Dear Lord," he muttered, gently scooping her up. Her body was alarmingly light, and he could feel the cold seeping through her thin clothes. He hurried back to the orphanage, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Help! Someone! Help!" he shouted as he burst through the doors. The staff sprang into action, their faces a mix of concern and urgency. Blankets were fetched, and the girl was placed near the roaring fireplace. Mrs. Abernathy, the headmistress, took charge, her stern demeanor softened by worry. "Who is she? Where did she come from?" Mrs. Abernathy asked, her voice filled with concern as she gently checked the girl's injuries. "I found her by the forest," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice trembling. She was alone, barely alive. Over the next few days, the girl remained unconscious, her small body fighting to recover. The children of the orphanage whispered among themselves, curious and concerned about the mysterious newcomer. They took turns sitting by her bedside, offering silent companionship. One morning, the girl's eyes fluttered open. She looked around, confused and frightened, clutching a small, snowflake-shaped pendant around her neck. Mrs. Abernathy was at her side in an instant. "Hello, dear," she said softly. "You're safe now. Can you tell us your name?" The girl blinked, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. I don't remember," she whispered. "My name is Annie. I'm 4 years old." Mrs. Abernathy exchanged a worried glance with the nurse. "It's all right, Annie. You're safe here. We'll take care of you." Annie's life at the orphanage began with uncertainty and fear, but she quickly adapted to her new environment. The other children, initially wary, soon accepted her as one of their own. She carried the snowflake pendant everywhere, a small token of a past she couldn't recall. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Annie's resilience shone through as she participated in daily activities, her laughter echoing through the halls of the orphanage. She was quick to learn and eager to help, endearing herself to the staff and children alike. Annie often sat by the window, watching the snowflakes dance outside, lost in thought. The pendant around her neck was a constant reminder of the unknown, but she held onto it as a symbol of hope. She had no memories of her family or her life before the accident, but she forged new bonds with the people around her. Her best friend, Lily, was a shy girl with big, curious eyes. The two girls became inseparable, exploring every nook and cranny of the orphanage together. They shared secrets, dreams, and the occasional mischievous adventure, their laughter a bright spot in the often gloomy atmosphere. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Annie confided in Lily. "I wish I could remember where I came from," she said, fingering the pendant, "but I feel like this place is my home now." Lily nodded, her expression serious. "Maybe it's not about where you came from, but where you're going." Annie smiled at her friend's wisdom. Years passed, and Annie grew into a determined and compassionate young woman. She took on responsibilities, helping the younger children and assisting the staff. Despite the lack of memories, Annie found a sense of belonging at the orphanage. She cherished the friendships she made and the lessons she learned. Her journey was just beginning, and she was determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead with courage and hope. Annie sat on her bed, gazing out of the window at the world beyond the orphanage walls. The familiar sounds of children playing echoed through the halls, but her mind was elsewhere. She had spent 14 years within these walls, and now, at 18, she yearned to experience life outside. The thought of independence both thrilled and terrified her. Gathering her courage, Annie decided it was time. She approached Ms. Alvarez, the head caregiver, who had always been a source of support and guidance. "Ms. Alvarez, can I talk to you for a moment?" Annie's voice was steady, though her heart raced. "Of course, Annie. What's on your mind?" Ms. Alvarez replied, her eyes warm and attentive. "I've been thinking, I want to try living on my own. I need to experience the world outside and see what I can make of myself." Ms. Alvarez studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I knew this day would come. You've grown into a strong, capable young woman. If you're sure this is what you want, I'll support you." "Thank you," Annie said, her voice filled with gratitude. That evening, Annie packed her belongings. She carefully placed the snowflake pendant around her neck, its weight a comforting reminder of her resilience. As she folded her clothes and gathered her few possessions, a mix of excitement and uncertainty swirled within her. She was leaving the only home she had known, stepping into a world filled with unknowns. The next morning, she said her goodbyes. Her friends gathered around, offering hugs and words of encouragement. The caregivers, who had been like family to her, wished her well with tears in their eyes. "You'll do great, Annie," one of the older girls said. "You've always been the strongest of us." Annie smiled, feeling a surge of confidence. "Thank you, everyone. I promise to stay in touch." With her suitcase in hand, Annie walked out of the orphanage gates. The city awaited her, bustling with life and opportunity. She took a deep breath, letting the sounds and sights of the world fill her senses. She was ready to embrace her new beginning. Days turned into weeks as Annie searched for work. She walked the streets of the city, handing out resumes to shops, cafes, and offices. Each rejection was a blow, but she remained determined. Her savings were dwindling, but she refused to give up. One afternoon, she spotted a sign in the window of a luxurious hotel. "Staff wanted." She walked in, her heart pounding. "Good afternoon," she greeted the receptionist. "I'm here to apply for the cleaning position." The receptionist looked her over, then handed her an application form. "Fill this out and wait over there. Someone will be with you shortly." Annie filled out the form, her hands slightly trembling. She waited, rehearsing what she would say. Soon, a woman in a crisp uniform approached her. "Hello, I'm Mrs. Turner, the housekeeping manager. Let's have a chat, shall we?" The interview was brief but thorough. Annie spoke about her time at the orphanage, the skills she had learned, and her eagerness to work hard. Mrs. Turner seemed impressed by her determination. "Well, Annie, you seem like a hard-working young woman. Can you start tomorrow?" Annie's eyes widened with relief and joy. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much." The next day, Annie began her job as a cleaner. Mrs. Turner introduced her to the team and showed her the ropes. The hotel was a world of opulence she had never seen before. Marble floors, chandeliers, and exquisite furnishings filled every corner. It was both overwhelming and inspiring. Annie's first day was a whirlwind of activity. She learned how to make beds with precision, polish surfaces until they gleamed, and ensure that every room met the hotel's high standards. Her colleagues were kind, offering tips and encouragement. "Don't worry if it feels like a lot," said Eleanor, a seasoned cleaner. "You'll get the hang of it. Just take it one step at a time." Annie nodded, absorbing every piece of advice. As the day ended, she felt a mix of exhaustion and accomplishment. She had taken her first step into the world and succeeded. Annie trudged home after a long day at the hotel, her feet aching and her mind weary. The sky had darkened, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement. As she approached her small apartment, she noticed a figure slumped against the door. Her heart skipped a beat. An elderly woman lay there unconscious, her clothes tattered and dirty. Annie hesitated, glancing around the empty street. She knew she couldn't just leave the woman there, but inviting a stranger into her home carried its own risks. She took a deep breath, then knelt beside the woman. "Mom, can you hear me?" Annie gently shook her shoulder. There was no response. She checked for a pulse and found it, weak but steady. Resolute, she slipped her arms under the woman and, with considerable effort, managed to get her inside. Annie laid the woman on the couch and went to fetch a damp cloth. She cleaned the dirt and grime from the woman's face and hands, revealing lines of age and hardship. After covering her with a blanket, Annie warmed some soup and set it on the table nearby, hoping the smell would help revive her. The woman stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around, confused and disoriented. Where am I?" she mumbled, her voice weak. "You're safe," Annie said softly, sitting down next to the couch. "I found you outside my apartment. My name is Annie. What's yours?" The woman stared at her, the question seeming to hang in the air as if she were trying to grasp an elusive memory. I don't remember," she finally said, a flicker of panic crossing her features. "I've been on the streets for so long. People in the park and those I met called me Isabella, so I just accepted it." Annie nodded, offering a reassuring smile. "Isabella, then. Would you like some soup? It might help you feel better." Isabella nodded gratefully, and Annie helped her sit up. She handed her the bowl, and Isabella sipped the soup slowly, the warmth bringing some color back to her cheeks. They sat in silence, the only sound the clinking of the spoon against the bowl. As the days passed, Annie and Isabella settled into a quiet routine. Annie continued to work at the hotel, her long hours making her appreciate the moments of peace at home even more. Each evening, she would return to find Isabella waiting, a small smile on her face. They shared meals, simple conversations, and moments of silent understanding. Annie learned that Isabella's memory loss was profound. She had no recollection of her life before the streets, and the years of hardship had taken their toll. Yet, despite everything, there was a gentle strength in Isabella, a resilience that Annie found both inspiring and comforting. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Annie asked, "Isabella, do you ever remember anything from before? Any flashes or feelings?" Isabella looked thoughtful, her eyes distant. "Sometimes I get glimpses," she said slowly. "A sound, a smell, it can trigger something, but it's always fleeting, like trying to catch smoke with my hands." Annie nodded, understanding the frustration and sadness in Isabella's voice. "Well, whatever your past, you have a place here now. You're not alone." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes, and she reached out to squeeze Annie's hand. "Thank you, Annie. You don't know what this means to me." Their bond deepened through these small, everyday interactions. They found solace in each other's presence, a shared understanding of loss and resilience. Annie would tell Isabella about her day at the hotel, the eccentric guests, and the camaraderie with her colleagues. In return, Isabella would share stories from her time on the streets, the people she met, and the small acts of kindness that had kept her going. One particularly chilly evening, they sat by the small heater, drinking tea. Annie glanced at Isabella, noticing the weariness in her eyes, but also the warmth and gratitude that had grown over the weeks. "Isabella, I've been thinking, what if we try to find out more about your past? Maybe we could piece together some clues." Isabella looked at her with a mix of hope and apprehension. "Do you really think we could? It's been so long, and I have so little to go on." "We can try," Annie said firmly. "We'll take it one step at a time. But no matter what we find, you have a home here with me." Isabella smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I would like that, Annie. I would like that very much." As they continued to navigate their lives together, Annie felt a growing sense of purpose. She had taken Isabella in out of compassion, but their relationship had blossomed into something deeper. They were no longer just a young woman and a homeless stranger. They were becoming family. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries, but Annie faced them with the knowledge that she and Isabella had each other. Annie adjusted her cleaning cart as she approached the VIP room. The door was marked with a brass plate that gleamed under the hallway lights. It read, "Carlos," and she knew this was one of the most prestigious suites in the hotel. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to be meticulous. Entering the room, Annie was struck by its opulence. The suite was expansive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over the rich mahogany furniture. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the crisp, clean air, and plush carpets muffled her footsteps as she moved. She began her work, carefully dusting the surfaces and polishing the mirrors. She changed the linens, ensuring every corner was perfectly tucked, and placed fresh towels in the bathroom. Her attention to detail was unwavering. She knew that guests in such rooms expected nothing less than perfection. As Annie moved to the sitting area, she noticed a photograph lying on the floor, partially hidden beneath an elegant armchair. Picking it up, she saw a man, a woman, and a child, all smiling at the camera. Her breath caught in her throat as she examined the image more closely. The woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Isabella. What caught her eye even more was the pendant around the woman's neck, a snowflake identical to the one Annie wore. A surge of curiosity and confusion flooded her mind. How could this be? She carefully placed the photo in her pocket, her mind racing with questions. Finishing her work in the suite, Annie couldn't wait to get home and show the photograph to Isabella. Later that evening, Annie sat across from Isabella at their small kitchen table, the photograph lying between them. Isabella looked at it, her brow furrowing in concentration. "I don't know these people," she said quietly, shaking her head. "Look at the pendant," Annie urged, lifting her own necklace to show the resemblance. Isabella's eyes widened as she saw the snowflake pendant in the photograph. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Isabella's hand moved to her forehead, and she winced as if in pain. "It's so familiar," she whispered. "But I can't remember." Her voice was strained, and her eyes filled with confusion. Annie reached out, placing a comforting hand on Isabella's arm. "It's okay," she said softly. "Take your time." Isabella's breathing became shallow, and her eyes darted around as fragmented memories began to assault her senses. She heard distant sounds, the screeching of tires, the crying of a child, and the blaring of a horn. Emotions rushed in, fear, love, and an overwhelming sense of loss. Her head throbbed with the effort to piece it all together. Suddenly, Isabella's body went limp, and she slumped forward onto the table. Annie jumped up, panic gripping her. Isabella! Isabella, wake up!" she cried, gently shaking her. But Isabella remained unconscious, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Annie quickly moved her to the sofa, laying her down and covering her with a blanket. She sat beside her, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort, though her own mind was a whirl of confusion and fear. Why did the pendant in the photo match hers? Why did Isabella look so much like the woman in the picture? As she watched over Isabella, Annie's thoughts churned. Could it be that Isabella was somehow connected to the people in the photograph? And if so, what did that mean for both of them? The resemblance was too strong to be mere coincidence, and the matching pendants suggested a deeper connection. Hours passed, and Annie didn't move from Isabella's side. Finally, Isabella began to stir, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at Annie, confusion still clouding her gaze. "What happened?" she asked weakly. "You fainted," Annie replied, her voice gentle. "You were trying to remember something about the photo." Isabella closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. I saw flashes of something, but it's all so unclear. It's like trying to remember a dream that slips away the moment you wake up." "It's okay," Annie said, squeezing her hand. "We'll figure it out together. But that pendant, it has to mean something. And the resemblance, it's too strong to ignore." Isabella nodded slowly, though her face remained etched with uncertainty. "I don't know what it all means, Annie, but I feel like this is important. I need to remember." Annie hugged Isabella gently, her mind still racing with possibilities. They had stumbled upon a mystery that seemed to tie their lives together in ways they couldn't yet understand. But one thing was clear: they needed to uncover the truth, no matter how long it took. The connection between them, the pendant, and the photograph was a puzzle that demanded to be solved. Annie's hands trembled slightly as she clutched the photograph and pendant in her bag. She had decided to return to the hotel to confront Carlos, seeking the answers that seemed to dance just out of reach. Her mind buzzed with a mixture of nerves and determination as she made her way through the bustling city streets, the early morning light casting long shadows on the pavement. Entering the grand lobby of the hotel, she took a deep breath to steady herself. The opulence of the place was both familiar and intimidating, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Annie approached the reception desk, her heart pounding. "I need to speak with Mr. Carlos," she said, her voice steady but firm. The receptionist eyed her curiously, but nodded. "One moment, please." She picked up the phone and spoke in hushed tones before directing Annie to a seating area. Moments later, Carlos appeared, his expression curious and slightly concerned. "Annie," he greeted her, extending a hand. "What brings you here?" Annie took a deep breath, pulling the photograph and pendant from her bag. "I found this in your room," she said, handing him the items. "The woman in the photo looks exactly like Isabella, and she's wearing the same pendant I have." Carlos's face paled as he took the photograph, his eyes widening in shock. He traced the image of the woman with trembling fingers. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And this child. Could it be?" "I don't know," Annie replied, her voice soft but urgent. "But we need to find out. There are too many coincidences." Carlos looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and pain. "Isabella and our daughter disappeared 14 years ago in a car accident. I've been searching for them ever since." "We need to be sure," Annie said, her determination shining through. "Can we do a DNA test?" Carlos nodded, regaining some composure. "Yes, absolutely. We need to know the truth." He paused, looking at Annie with renewed intensity. "But while we wait for the results, we should also investigate what happened all those years ago." Back at the apartment, Annie carefully collected hair samples from Isabella and herself. She explained the plan to Isabella, who listened with a mix of apprehension and hope. "This might give us the answers we need," Annie said gently, trying to reassure her. Isabella nodded, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "I want to remember, Annie. I want to know who I really am." The samples were sent to a lab, and the waiting began. In the meantime, Annie and Carlos delved into the past, piecing together the fragments of a mystery that had haunted them both for years. They pored over old police reports, visited the site of the accident, and spoke to anyone who might have information. Days turned into weeks, and the anticipation grew heavier with each passing moment. Carlos and Annie spent their evenings going over every detail, their bond strengthening as they shared their hopes and fears. Isabella, though still struggling with her fragmented memories, found solace in their presence, feeling a connection that defied explanation. Annie and Carlos spent their days diving into the murky waters of the past. The once comfortable routines of their lives were replaced by a relentless quest for answers. Each morning, they set out with a list of places to visit and people to interview, driven by the need to understand what had truly happened 14 years ago. Their first stop was the site of the accident. The road, now a quiet stretch of asphalt bordered by tall trees, held no visible scars from the tragedy that had unfolded there. Carlos stood silently, his eyes scanning the area as if hoping to find some hidden clue left behind. Annie approached him, her voice soft but firm. "We should talk to the people who lived nearby. Maybe someone saw something that night." Carlos nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, let's start there." They knocked on doors, spoke with anyone who had been around at the time. Most people had vague memories, if any, of the accident. It had been so long ago, and the details had faded into the background of their lives. But a few offered scraps of information, glimpses of a black car speeding away, the sound of screeching tires, a figure moving in the shadows. Piece by piece, Annie and Carlos began to assemble a clearer picture. They tracked down old police reports, spoke to retired officers who had worked the case. It became evident that the investigation had been hampered from the start. Key evidence had gone missing, and leads had been mysteriously dropped. The deeper they dug, the more apparent it became that Ricardo and Javier had orchestrated a meticulous cover-up. Carlos's face grew darker with each revelation. "They did this," he muttered, clenching his fists. "They tore our family apart for their own gain." Annie placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "We'll make them pay. But first, we need to prove it." Their search led them to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, where a former employee of Ricardo's now worked as a night guard. The man was reluctant to talk at first, but a few pointed questions and the sight of Carlos's determined face loosened his tongue. "I remember that night," he said, his voice rough with age and regret. "There were a lot of calls, a lot of movement. Ricardo was frantic, and Javier was giving orders like a man possessed. They made sure no one looked too closely at what happened." Carlos and Annie thanked the man and left, the weight of the truth pressing down on them. They had the pieces. Now they needed to fit them together in a way that would hold up in court. While they continued their investigation, the DNA results came back. Carlos opened the envelope with trembling hands, Annie by his side. The confirmation that Annie was indeed his daughter and Isabella his wife brought a flood of emotions. Relief, joy, and an overwhelming sense of justice mingled in their hearts. They rushed home to share the news with Isabella. She sat on the edge of her seat, eyes wide with hope. When Carlos revealed the results, her face broke into a smile that was both radiant and heartbreaking. "We're really a family," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "After all this time?" Annie hugged her tightly. "Yes, we are, and we'll face whatever comes next together." As the days passed, Isabella began to remember more details about the accident and the sinister plan that had followed. Together, they continued to gather evidence, building a case that would bring Ricardo and Javier to justice. They worked tirelessly, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. The emotional toll was heavy, but the sense of purpose and the strength of their reunited family kept them going. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, Annie looked at her parents with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "We're getting closer," she said. I can feel it." Carlos reached across the table, taking Isabella's hand in his. "We'll see this through to the end. For us, and for everything we've lost." Isabella squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with determination. "Together, we can do anything." In that moment, despite the darkness of their past and the uncertainty of their future, they felt a glimmer of hope. They were a family, bound by love and strengthened by their shared ordeal. And together, they would uncover the full truth and reclaim the life that had been stolen from them. Isabella sat in the small, sunlit kitchen, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. Her eyes, distant and clouded, reflected the turmoil of fragmented memories that haunted her. Annie and Carlos sat across from her, their expressions a mix of encouragement and concern. "I remember the night of the accident," Isabella began slowly, her voice trembling. "There were lights, bright lights coming towards us, and then the sound of metal crashing, screams. Everything went dark." Annie leaned in, her voice gentle. "Take your time, Isabella. What else can you recall?" Isabella closed her eyes, trying to force the pieces of her memory into place. "Ricardo. He was there, after the accident. I remember his voice, cold and calculating. He said something about making sure Carlos pays." Carlos's jaw tightened. "Ricardo. I knew it," he muttered. "He orchestrated all of this." Isabella nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "He and Javier. They planned it all. They wanted to destroy you, take everything you had built. I remember Javier. He was the one who gave the orders to separate us." The emotional toll was evident in Isabella's face, each memory a painful reminder of the betrayal and loss. Annie reached out, holding her mother's hand. "We'll get through this together. We have to gather all the evidence we can." Carlos agreed. "We need to reopen the case. We can't let them get away with this." The family enlisted the help of a private detective, a seasoned professional named Alejandro, who had a reputation for uncovering the truth in even the most convoluted cases. Alejandro met them at their home, his demeanor calm and focused. "We have a lot of ground to cover," Alejandro said, spreading out a map of the city and marking key locations. "We'll start with the scene of the accident and work our way through any possible witnesses and evidence." Days turned into weeks as they delved into the past. They visited the accident site multiple times, scrutinizing every detail. Alejandro's expertise proved invaluable as he uncovered discrepancies in the original police reports and identified potential witnesses who had never been interviewed. One such witness was a retired truck driver named Manuel. He had been driving the night of the accident and had seen the events unfold from a distance. His testimony was crucial. "I saw a car speeding away from the scene right after the crash," Manuel recounted. "It was a black sedan, and it didn't stop. I always thought it was suspicious." Isabella's memories also provided vital clues. She recalled overhearing Ricardo and Javier discussing their plans in a warehouse near the docks. The team searched the area and found an old ledger hidden in a dusty corner, detailing financial transactions that pointed directly to Ricardo and Javier's involvement in the scheme. As they pieced together the evidence, the emotional strain began to show. Carlos, usually composed and strong, was visibly worn. Annie, too, felt the weight of their quest for justice, but she remained steadfast, drawing strength from the bond with her parents. The tension was palpable as they prepared to confront Ricardo and Javier. Every new piece of evidence brought a mix of hope and anxiety. They knew the risks involved. Ricardo and Javier were powerful men who would stop at nothing to protect themselves. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, reviewing their findings, Alejandro spoke up. "We've built a strong case, but we need to be careful. They'll try to discredit us, intimidate us. We have to be ready for anything." Carlos nodded, his resolve hardening. "We've come this far. We can't back down now." Isabella, her voice steady despite the lingering fear, added, "They took everything from us. It's time we took it back." The days leading up to the confrontation were filled with a flurry of activity. Legal documents were prepared, witnesses were briefed, and every detail was meticulously checked. The air was thick with anticipation, each moment stretching into an eternity. Finally, the day arrived. They gathered outside the courthouse, their faces set with determination. The tension was electric, the culmination of months of painstaking work and emotional upheaval. The courtroom buzzed with an undercurrent of tension, the air thick with anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers, journalists whispered among themselves, and the audience's murmurs ebbed and flowed like a restless tide. Annie, Carlos, and Isabella sat together, their faces set with determination, their hands clasped in silent solidarity. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice echoing off the wooden panels. "The case of Carlos Sanchez versus Ricardo and Javier Dominguez will now proceed." Carlos's lawyer, Mr. Garcia, stood and began his opening statement. "Your Honor, members of the jury, we are here to seek justice for a grievous wrong committed 14 years ago. This is a case of calculated sabotage, deceit, and a family's suffering. We will prove that Ricardo and Javier Dominguez orchestrated the accident that tore this family apart." Ricardo's lawyer, a sleek man with a smooth voice, countered swiftly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the accusations against my clients are unfounded and driven by emotions rather than facts. We will show that Ricardo and Javier are innocent of these baseless claims." The trial began in earnest, with the prosecution presenting its evidence. Photos, financial records, and witness testimonies painted a damning picture. Manuel, the retired truck driver, took the stand first. "I saw a black sedan speeding away from the scene," Manuel testified, his voice steady. "It was suspicious. They didn't stop to help." The defense tried to discredit him, questioning his memory and motives. Manuel held firm, his eyes meeting the jury's with unwavering resolve. "I know what I saw." Next, Alejandro presented the ledger found in the warehouse, detailing Ricardo and Javier's financial transactions. "This ledger proves that they had the means and the motive to sabotage Carlos's business," Alejandro explained, his tone crisp and authoritative. The defense argued it was circumstantial, but the jury's faces showed doubt. Piece by piece, the prosecution built their case, each new revelation tightening the noose around Ricardo and Javier. Finally, it was time for Isabella's testimony. The room grew hushed as she approached the stand, her steps measured but resolute. She took her seat and faced the courtroom, her eyes briefly meeting Annie's for strength. "Please, state your name for the record," Mr. Garcia began. "Isabella Sanchez," she said, her voice clear despite the tremor beneath it. "Isabella, can you tell us what you remember about the night of the accident?" Isabella took a deep breath. "We were driving home. There was a bright light, and then the sound of metal crashing. I remember being pulled from the car. I heard Ricardo's voice. He said something about making sure Carlos would pay." Her words hung in the air, the weight of her testimony pressing down on the room. The defense attorney rose to cross-examine her, his demeanor sharp and probing. "Mrs. Sanchez, it's been 14 years. Are you sure your memory is accurate? Couldn't it be a case of mistaken identity?" Isabella's eyes flashed with anger. "I may have lost my memories for a time, but I know what I heard. It was Ricardo. He and Javier planned this." The lawyer pressed on, trying to sow seeds of doubt, but Isabella stood firm, her voice unwavering. "They wanted to ruin Carlos. They took everything from us." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Each word from Isabella resonated with the jury, her bravery and pain shining through. The defense's attempts to undermine her were met with the same steady resolve that had carried her through years of loss and recovery. As Isabella finished her testimony, Mr. Garcia presented the final piece of evidence, the DNA results. These results confirm that Annie is Carlos and Isabella's daughter. They prove the lengths Ricardo and Javier went to separate this family. The jury listened intently, their faces a mix of shock and anger. The defense scrambled to counter the mounting evidence, but their arguments grew increasingly desperate. Ricardo and Javier's composed facades began to crack under the pressure. Annie watched the proceedings, her heart pounding. She felt a surge of pride for her mother's courage and her father's relentless pursuit of justice. They had come so far, faced so much, and now the truth was finally being laid bare. The trial continued with each side presenting their closing arguments. Mr. Garcia's voice was filled with passion as he addressed the jury. "This is not just a case about money or business. It's about a family that was torn apart by greed and malice. I urge you to see the truth and deliver justice for the Sanchez family." The defense made their final plea, but the doubt and fear in their eyes betrayed their uncertainty. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and the jury's expressions hinted at their brewing verdict. The courtroom was a blend of anticipation and finality as the judge read the verdict. "We find the defendants, Ricardo and Javier, guilty on all charges," the foreman announced, his voice steady and clear. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, a weight lifting from those who had waited so long for this moment. Carlos, Annie, and Isabella sat together, their hands intertwined, their hearts pounding with a mix of relief and vindication. The judge pronounced the sentences, ensuring that Ricardo and Javier would face long prison terms for their crimes. Justice had been served. Annie turned to her parents, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We did it." Carlos nodded, his eyes glistening. "Yes, we did. Together." Isabella squeezed their hands, her own eyes filled with tears. "I never thought this day would come," she said softly, "but now we can finally move forward." The family embraced, a profound sense of peace and closure settling over them. The years of pain and struggle had led to this moment, and now they could begin to heal. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight, they felt a renewed sense of hope and unity. In the weeks that followed, they focused on rebuilding their lives. Carlos, drawing from his own experiences, started programs to help victims of crime. He used his resources and connections to provide support and advocacy for those who had suffered similar injustices. One afternoon, Annie accompanied Carlos to a meeting with a group of volunteers. She watched as he spoke passionately about the importance of their work, his determination to make a difference evident in every word. After the meeting, she approached him. "Dad, you're doing amazing work," she said, pride in her voice. "I'm so glad you're helping others." Carlos smiled, his expression filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Annie. It's something I need to do. It's a way to give back and ensure that what happened to us doesn't happen to others." Isabella, too, found her own path to healing. She began engaging in charitable activities, dedicating her time to helping the homeless and those in need. One evening, as she served meals at a local shelter, she felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that had been missing for so long. A young woman approached her, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for being here," she said. "You don't know how much this means to us." Isabella smiled, her heart warmed by the connection. "It's my pleasure," she replied. "We all need a little help sometimes." Annie, inspired by her parents' resilience and determination, threw herself into her studies. She was determined to become a nurse, to care for others, and make a positive impact in their lives. Her days were filled with classes and clinical rotations, each step bringing her closer to her goal. One evening, as she studied late into the night, Isabella entered her room with a cup of tea. "You've been working so hard," she said, placing the cup on Annie's desk. "I'm so proud of you." Annie looked up, exhaustion mingling with gratitude. "Thank you, Mum. I just want to make a difference. Like you and Dad." Isabella hugged her, the bond between them stronger than ever. "You already are, Annie. You already are." The family's journey was far from over, but they faced the future with a newfound strength and determination. They had weathered the storm together, and now they stood ready to embrace the possibilities that lay ahead. On a warm spring day, they gathered in the backyard of their home, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. Carlos looked around at his family, a deep sense of contentment settling over him. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "And we have so much to look forward to." Annie nodded, her eyes bright with hope. "We do, and whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Isabella reached out, taking their hands in hers. "Together," she echoed, a smile spreading across her face. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden, they sat in peaceful silence, the unspoken bond between them a testament to their resilience and love. They had found justice, and now they were building a future grounded in hope and unity. No matter what challenges lay ahead, they knew they had each other. And that was enough. And that brings us to the end of today's emotional and intense chapter of Carlos, Isabella, and Annie's journey toward justice. What an incredible story of resilience, determination, and the unbreakable bond of family. If you were as captivated by their story as I was, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more riveting content like this. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an update on our next exciting installment. And hey, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on today's chapter. How did it make you feel? What do you think will happen next in their quest for justice? Thank you so much for watching and being a part of our community. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, stay inspired, stay hopeful, and remember, every story has the power to change lives. See you in the next video.